All right. Sorry, I was slow getting back here. I was on the other computer typing. This is Bill Donahue. Bill Donahue, Discerning Truth. It's Freaky Friday. We're according to California. I go a little off the rails. So today, instead of just talking about Jesus and the books in the Bible, we're going to talk about the Shroud of Turin. And I just, you know, I got to tell you, in the 1980s, they did some carbon 14 testing on the Shroud of Turin, and it came up with a dates that were very similar and in the date range of where the shroud is first officially recorded as existing in history. So, what do you call it? That kind of put it off the rails for me. I went, okay, it's an interesting artifact, but if it doesn't show up until the Middle Ages, and then you carbon 14 date it, and it comes up with a date in the Middle Ages, those two data points point at not being first century. And I'm not really big into artifacts the church has really gone off the rails. They got bones of saints, they got different stuff, pieces of the cross, supposed cross, were sent around the empire and are almost worshipped in churches. You have, even in the Old Testament, when God sent the serpents to bite the children of Israel, and then he had to make a brazen serpent. Okay, a serpent is a sign of sin after the devil, and the bronze serpent, and hung it on a pole, is a symbol of sin being judged. It's a metaphor that's going to be taken for Jesus, because he became sin and was lifted up on a pole and judged for us. But they had to destroy it because they were worshiping that brazen serpent, and this has always been a problem. And I don't want to be that into that worshiping icons. But so I just kind of dismissed the Shroud of Turin, but for God knows what reason, it's been all over my feed recently. And Jeremiah Johnson had his interview with Tucker, and there's a lot of things about Tucker Carlson that bother me. But he does get a lot of hits, and it raises a lot of interest in things that go on. So I just kind of, Johnson mentioned a few things, and one being that those carbon 14 testing dates are now generally considered to be false. And I went, well, wait a second. If this is my second point of data that's telling me this is no good and it's not real and it's not bad, then let me take a new look at this. And I got to tell you, my first thing is, if I came to the conclusion today that this was absolutely fake, it wouldn't affect my faith at all. And if I came to the conclusion that this is likely the burial cloth of Christ, it wouldn't affect my faith at all. It's not there. Whether or not Jesus got out of the tomb is not affected by whether or not the shroud is authentic. But if it's authentic, that's a pretty cool little piece of evidence, right? But I'm not a person that's going to jump into buying into something's authentic just because it's popular, right? It's a lot of the most popular people out here that talk out of their butts. I mean, I'm having a great week. This is not a political show. I don't do politics. You want politics? California is my buddy. He'll connect the Bible to politics for you. I don't do politics. But I'm loving this week, because it doesn't mean I'm not interested in politics. You have these people, and supposedly MAGA people, right, that have been talking crap about Kash Patel and the president and Pam Bondi and all that stuff for ages, right? And now they're all trying to get on the bandwagon. I mean, this has been fun to see. And then you have, oh my God, what's that economist's name? Jeffrey Sachs, who's for years said Trump was too stupid to settle the Russia-Ukraine war, that his tariffs were the worst idea ever, that they would never work, told the Europeans to ignore them. I mean, these are people out here that claim to be in the interest of our country, and they're all eating crow, and I'm loving it. So just because something's popular, a popular idea, I mean, Steve Bannon's got a big popular show. I think he's one of the biggest buffoons on the internet. Okay, I never bother with Alex Jones, right? Other people think Alex Jones is the best thing since sliced bread. I don't go on with what's popular. And just because the Shroud is popular doesn't mean I'm going to buy into it because it's popular. And that's what I want you to understand. And that's I only mention the political things is to give you an idea. I do this in my entire life. Just because somebody puts out facts, my thing is, where's the beef? What's the legitimacy? What is the actual evidence? And if there's actual evidence into something, I'll believe it. And if there isn't, I won't. And belief doesn't mean you have to be 100% certain. And I try to make this clear to everybody. There are certain things in life. Does God exist? I'm as close to 100% certain as I can be. There's always room for philosophical doubt. And I mean, I'm just burdened by what's called Cartesian doubt after Rene Descartes. Okay, I always know that it's possible I don't even exist, and I'm in the imagination of somebody. So you have, I can never get to 100% certainty that something is true or not true. But if I'm over 50%, then I believe it. And if I'm under 50%, I don't believe it. Now, in some things, like I said, God existing, I'm closer to 100%. Jesus getting out of the tomb, pretty darn close to 100%, right? Do I believe in, a half dozen other different things? I might be 80%, right? Was the flood global, or was it a localized flood that was being used as a metaphor? I might be 80%, right? I still believe it, but I have more room for doubt. And I would do the same thing here with the Shroud. If I can get over 50%, I might say I believe it's real, but that doesn't mean I'm certain it's real. And if I'm less than 50%, and that's where I was in the 80s, I was less than 50% because two major important testable pieces of data both agreed it was Middle Age creation. And there's a lot of things in the ancient world that we can't recreate today. Ask your best engineers to recreate the Great Pyramid of Giza. They can't even recreate the cement used between the blocks, so they can't recreate it. Okay? We're modern equipment. We supposedly sent people to the moon and did all kinds of other stuff, right? We can't do something the ancients did. That doesn't bother me. So if somebody in the Middle Ages figured out how to make the Shroud, it doesn't hurt my faith, right? But here's what's going on. If you actually saw the Shroud in person, this is what it would look like. And you can see there's a very faint image of a face there. You might be able to, on the left side, you might be able to see the arms coming down, like crossed near the groin area, down in that part of the body. You can kind of make out the chest area. Not a lot of details. This is what it looks like in real life. When you see pictures of the Shroud that are impressive, they are negatives. Because the idea is the Shroud is a negative. So by the negative of the Shroud would actually be the photo, right? So when you do a negative of the Shroud, that image appears much more detailed. Suddenly you can see the hair, the hands, you can see the beard and the face more clearly, right? And so that's pretty cool effect. no matter who you are. And if you want to see a blow up of that face position, right? This is a blow up of the face on the shroud. Okay? And so you look at it. So another thing that bothered me is in the days of Jesus, it would have been unusual for you to have long hair. Now, if he was born lived in Nazareth, but it doesn't say he took a Nazarene vow. If he had a Nazarene vow, you don't cut your hair. So he might have had a Nazarene vow, and it's just not recorded in the Bible. But what you have here is the face of a guy, and I've seen a plaster cast done of that face, and trying to reproduction of what they're seeing on here. And I don't know what's going on his head there with that plaster cast, but there seems to be something up there. Is his hair messed up or what's happening? But you have a man, not particularly attractive man, right? His nose seems to have been damaged, and we know Jesus got beat pretty badly, and by the Romans. So I'd expect his face to be a little marred. But the Bible says there's nothing about him, his image, his face that would attract you to him. And we often make Jesus like beautiful, the Middle Ages art of Jesus. He's a fine-looking man, right? But you don't. In fact, you've seen people try to create his face, and they've said that face is Jesus looks like the picture on the far right, that half a face. That doesn't look anything like the shroud. And then you've seen the other half of the face is an AI representation of what's on the shroud. It looks a lot closer to the shroud. But I'm not even sure the half of the face on the left of that split screen totally matches the shroud. I think the plastic cast does a better job. But you have a two very different looking men. Well, if your idea of what Jesus looks like is the guy on the far right, then of course you're going to think the shroud's fake because he looks like what we think of him. But what got me with the shroud is when they started looking at actual blood stains on the shroud and spots where they could detect there were wounds. They reproduced this hyper-realistic image of a person, and there's things in this image that caught my attention. The number of wounds described the kind of beating that Jesus had. Okay? These wounds look more to me like a whip than a cat of nine tails ripping the flesh off, but that's not there. But this man in the image has his legs bent and his head bent. Well, if Jesus is laid down flat on the slab and this shroud's put over him, why would his legs be bent? It indicates that rigor mortis had already started to set in while he was hanging on the cross, and they put him in the tomb, and that his body was already in a state of rigor. And that is consistent with the timing on the Bible. And if you died in rigor mortis, the head would have been leaning forward a little bit, right, as you die. The knees are bent while the body is trying to be held up on the cross. But the arms would have been outstretched. Rigor mortis would not have been so great that you couldn't force the arms down, right? You could have forced the legs down, but the legs have bigger muscles than the arms. But if you force the arms down from a upstretched cross position, right, the elbows would have been bent somewhat coming out there, and you get the position that the arms are in. This all is consistent with somebody dying in a state of rigor mortis in a crucified position. And that's what was there. So it's intriguing to me. So I went back and I watched Tucker's interview with Jeremiah Johnston, and Jeremiah Johnston's claim to fame, I mean, he's like all in on the Shroud. The Shroud is it, right? But I always watch for people how honest they are and stuff. And what they, if they're not honest in the details on one thing, I start questioning them on other things. And Johnson claims that there are only two dates Jesus could have been crucified, either AD 30 or AD 33. Okay? And both those dates are based on questionable assumptions. Okay? The way we date the Jewish calendar today, the 19-year cycle where they decide where the extra months go in, didn't exist at the time of Jesus. So any date you go back before they established that calendar system, you're retrocalculating using a system they did not use. So you don't know that your dates are correct. But using a retrocalculated calendar date, we've come up with 2 years where we think Passover would have occurred on a Friday in the time frame when Jesus could have died, in their 30 and 33 AD. But the whole reason to believe that Jesus died on a Friday is because it says they were taking him off the cross before the Sabbath. But if you study the Old Testament, you know that after the Passover on the 14th of Nisan, the next day, starting at sundown, the 15th of Nisan, is the start of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. It is a high holy day. It is a Sabbath. So whether Jesus was crucified on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, any day of the week, whenever that day was, that evening would have been a Sabbath, no matter what. And for Johnson to come out and say that the only two possible years are 30 and 33 tells me either he doesn't understand the material or he's brushing over stuff that might not hold it. Right? And then he claimed, the second thing he claimed in that thing was that the shroud is covered in pints of blood. That's clearly not true. Now, I used to ranch, and I butchered a lot of animals. I hunted my whole life, and I have butchered hogs and cattle and everything. And I'm telling you, the amount of blood, pints of blood, is a gigantic mess. Okay? It is not little stains on a cloth. If the shroud was covered and had pints of blood in it, you would have no image. It would be completely blood. So when Johnson said that shroud has pints of blood, that was the second thing in very short order in the interview that I caught Johnson either being dishonest in or showing no knowledge of the subject. And that got a problem for me, right? The next thing Johnson said in an interview is that they know Jesus died from cardiac arrest. But that and that speculation was proven by his blood chemistry. I searched everywhere I could search. I'd never heard that statement before. I looked for those blood chemistry tests that said Jesus died of cardiac arrest. I can find no evidence of that. Right? And I went, okay, here's the third thing in quick order that doesn't seem credible. And then Johnson told Trucker that women were crucified naked, and many of them were hung facing the cross for pornographic reasons. And people were crucified naked, right, to maximize the humiliation. And there are records of women being crucified naked to maximize their humiliation, right? But when I looked at historians like Appian and Plutarch, they note that women that supported or fought in the rebellion were crucified alongside men. There's in Spartacus' slave revolt, there is no mention of them being crucified facing the cross or their buttocks sticking out in some kind of for pornographic reasons. Right? So this is every record, Tacitus, that I could go back and look for, and I specifically searched for this, that says it, confirms that women were crucified, and they were crucified naked, just like men were crucified naked, okay, to maximize humiliation. None of them. So where's Johnston getting this idea? Or was that just titillation for Tucker? And Tucker doesn't know enough to question it. Part of my issue with Tucker as an interviewer is when people say stuff, he hasn't done enough background research to question anything they say. He just nods his head like, wow, that's amazing. And I see this with a lot of interviewers, not just Tucker, but it's like, to me, that's a defect. If I'm going to interview you, I'm going to read your stuff. I'm going to know what you say, and I'm going to question you on stuff that might not be accurate, or find out where's the beef, what's going on. And Tucker didn't question him on any of this stuff. And I'm just listening to the interview, picking out things that I'm going, well, I've never heard that. Where's that coming from? Where's the beef? This isn't true, right? Now, Johnson put out what he claimed was a replica of the crown of thorns, and it looked like a helmet, right? And he says that this is a replica of the crown of thorns that was put on Jesus. Now, we usually think of like a halo of thorns. And Johnson said, no, it's a crown. And you know that because there's 50 puncture wounds around the head and neck and nape of the neck, and that, and blood stains on the scalp to prove it was one of these things. Okay? One, I don't see those level of that puncture wounds that match that helmet on this hyper-realistic recreation of Jesus, including his face. No Roman or Jewish historian, not Tacitus, Suetonius, not Josephus, not Philo, describe a helmet-shaped thorny device being used in crucifixions by the Romans. Okay? Now, there is a relic venerated as the crown of thorns, and it's housed in the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. Okay? And I don't know if that relic is real. If it's a real crown of thorns or it's a fake. And that's the problem with a lot of relics. Right? We don't know. There's enough wood claiming to be part of a piece of the original cross that we could have built a boat with them, probably. Not just a cross. Right? So what you have here is what has been venerated as the type of crown for years, matches the wounds that are on the body, right? It's there, matches the historical record that doesn't support Johnson's position, and nobody supports his position about it being a crown like that I could find, but he says it's absolute reproduction of what he was. Then Johnson said it would take 40 billion watts of power required to make the shroud. Okay? Now, this appears to be a slight exaggeration of conclusions in this guy, Pablo de Lazaro, right? And his colleagues at the National Agency for New Technologies, Energy, and Sustainable Economic Development, which they abbreviate as ENEA, okay, is he did experiments in 2011 to 2015, and his team calculated that the color to do this coloring on the surface, the size of the shroud, with the laser, right? Because the shroud is 14.3 feet by 3.7 feet, that it would require a UV laser with an intensity of about 34 billion watts per square centimeter for a fraction of a second. Okay? Now, that doesn't mean it's 34 billion watts of power. Okay? This is Johnson doesn't understand electricity, but he looks like he took that 34 billion watts of UV light and converted it to watts of electricity and then just exaggerated a little bit to 40 billion watts. I can't find anybody supporting the 40 billion, but I said if somebody says 34 billion and you make it 40 billion, I mean, that could be misspeaking. I'm not going to hold them too tight for this, right? But he was making all these mistakes or fabrications, and I'm not sure which one it was in the interview, but he also presented some good evidence for the shroud, and that's why I decided to take another look at this. And some of the evidence had to do the shroud's existence before the 14th century. Okay? And understand this. Before the 14th century, before about 1350, there is no absolutely certain evidence that the shroud existed. Okay? But some historians have linked the shroud to earlier relics. It's sometimes called the Mandy Leon or the image of Edessa. Right. It's a cloth, so it supposedly with Christ's face, and it's venerated in the Byzantine Empire as early as the 6th century. Well, we don't have that cloth. And in AD 944, a document describes the transfer of that mandolin or the image from Edessa to Constantinople. And it's unclear whether this image of the face of Christ also contained his body, or if they could just see the face, and that was, when I showed the original picture of the shroud, the head and face are the most easily visible. Did they fold this cloth to where just the head was shown and were showing people the face of Jesus, what they claimed was the face of Jesus? And that's what these historians are claiming, that this image of Edessa is actually the shroud, and it's here before 1350, that they have it back as far as the 6th century, and they can document it moving to Constantinople in AD 944. And why this is going to matter as you trace that. Because another theory speculates, and I have this in big letters, speculate, green. I try to let you know when we're speculating, that the shroud was held by the Knights Templar after the Fourth Crusade in 1204 AD. Okay? And that's when Constantinople was sacked. Okay? So what you have here is this image of Edessa. We know from history it gets to Constantinople in 944. Then we have speculation that the Knights Templar took it from Constantinople in 1204 AD, or sometime around 1204, right? And then they look at the Knights Templar were accused of worshiping an artifact called Baphomet, okay? And it's sometimes called the head. And it could be a cloth, but it might not have been a cloth. Some things think the Baphomet was actually a carved image, but they were trying to accuse the Knights Templar of being a part of a cult religion. And the church had turned against the Knights Templar, and they were trying to do it. So what you have is they were torturing these Knights Templar to death, and they got some confessions out of them. Well, when your confessions under torture are not really the best source of information. So the earliest documentation of the shroud actually existing comes from Geoffroy de Charnay. He's a French knight, right? And his wife, who's Jeanne de Vergey. And this is 1354, 14th century AD. That's the first time that we know of the shroud that we have today is existing. And the shroud is first publicly exhibited around 1357, so pretty quickly after we know it exists. It starts attracting pilgrims to there in about 1389, and Bishop Pierre de Arquez Choice writes to Pope Clement the Eighth, right? Clement the Seventh, claiming the shroud was displayed as the true burial cloth of Christ, and alleges it was a painted forgery. Okay, so the first record that we have of the shroud is somebody saying, hey, they're displaying this thing that's supposed to be the burial cloth of Christ, and it's a forgery. How did he know it's a forgery? We don't know. Did he suspect it was a forgery and just is jumping to that conclusion? We don't know. Okay? But in AD 1453, like 100 years later, right? Marguerite de Charme, same name, lacking any heirs, sold or transferred the shroud to the Duke Louis de Savoy, and the House of Savoy becomes its custodians, moving it to Chambéry, France, where it's kept in the Saint Chapelle. In AD 1534, 1532, there's a fire that damaged the cloths, leaving marks and stains from the water that was used to extinguish it. Those burn marks are on the cloth. You can see where it's been repaired. There are water stains there. We all know how that happened, right? Now, in 1578, the shroud was relocated by the Duke Emmanuel Philibert of Savoy. Okay, it's still the House of Savoy, where it remained, right? And went to Turin, Italy at that point, and that's why we call it the Shroud of Turin, right? Except during wartime evacuations. Like sometimes they move it out, and if they're at war, not wanting it to fall into enemy hands. But I want you to back up a minute to 1350. Remember that guy, Geoffrey de Charme? He's the first guy that we know had the shroud. He's a French knight. The Knights Templar were a lot of times French knights. They're officially dissolved in 1312, before this Geoffrey de Charme exists. But when we go back to 1307, when they're really got put down by Pope Clement V, right? And so from 1300 to 1307, the Pope is stamping out the Knights Templar. We have this other guy with the exact same name, Geoffrey de Charme, who is a Knights Templar. He's a preceptor of Normandy, and he is executed alongside Jacques de Molay, who's if anybody in Masons or whatever, you've heard that name, Jacques de Molay. He's the Templar Grand Master. So executed alongside him is somebody with the exact same name as somebody else 50 years later who has the shroud. And we thought the Templars might have taken it out of Constantinople in 1207. This is pretty tight history here. This is all speculation because we don't know if these two Geoffrey de Charme are related in any way, shape, or form. I don't have an Ancestry.com genealogy to show you that the one is the son or the grandson of the other, right? But what we have is a speculation based on the fact that we have two people of the exact same name 50 years apart. One is a Knights Templar who might have been in possession of the shroud, and one is a French knight not identified as a Templar who we know was in possession of the shroud. So that the Templar history is so shrouded in mystery that it leaves open a lot of room for speculation. The Da Vinci Code, Holy Blood, Holy Grail, they all got all the speculation mixed in with. There's a little history and a lot of speculation. And I'm telling you, this is speculation here. Could there be beef there? Maybe. But I don't know if there's beef because there's not enough facts to do it. The Mandalorian, or the image of Edessa, right, is a legendary, hear this word, legendary Christian relic, described as a cloth bearing in the miraculous image of Christ's face. According to tradition, legend, right? It was, and I can't do this Greek word, but it means not made of human hands. It was, according to tradition, they thought this face was not something that humans could have made. Okay? It was venerated in Eastern Orthodox tradition as a sacred image, but they lost it somewhere. The earliest references to this image of Edessa appear in the 6th century text. Okay, in Evagrius Scholasticus account, and I couldn't get an English translation of this. I'm reporting to you the record that that's where it is. Normally, I would go get that actual and English translation of that 6th century book and verify it's there. I couldn't get that far. But according to legend, okay, King Abdar V of Edessa was supposedly a contemporary of Jesus, and he was ill and requested Jesus visit him, and Jesus, unable to go, reportedly pressed his face onto a cloth, leaving an imprint, which was sent to Abgar and healed him. Well, that couldn't have happened after the resurrection. After the crucifixion. So this legend of how this cloth was created doesn't fit with it being the burial cloth of Christ. But we have legend, tradition, speculation. That's, once you get back here, that's all there is. By the 10th century, the mandolin was revered relic in Edessa. So we're talking in the 900s. And that's when we see it move to Constantinople in AD 944. So this legendary relic is reported to have existed from the 6th century. That would have been in the 500 ADs to the 900s when it moves to Constantinople, and then we lose track of it. Is it the shroud? Is this legendary image of the face of Jesus? Were they actually venerating the shroud all this time? This is all speculation, right? And another theory speculates that the shroud was held by the Knights Templar after the Fourth Crusade, or around 1204 AD. And they took it out of there before Constantinople was sacked by the Muslims, right? And then we have another in the 13th century and going into the 14th century, the early 1300s. The Templars are accused of having an artifact called the head. Is it a piece of cloth? Is it a piece of wood? Was it an actual skull? We don't know what it was. The testimony is different. So shortly before the existence of the shroud is first made publicly known in France, where we actually have history of it in 1350, we have a Templar connection both to Constantinople and to France with a guy of the same name, Geoffrey de Charme. Okay, and that's where the speculation gets. And you go, okay, there's enough here for me to go, yeah, maybe, but not enough for me to say, yeah, I'm convinced, right? And during the suppression of the Templars, and this is really 1307 to 1312, the Templars were accused of worshiping an idol, often described as a head. With their inquisitors, they called it a Baphomet. Okay, that this was their god, their idol that they were worshiping. And then some Templars described it being a bearded head or a skull made out of metal or wood. So the confessions are not consistent as what it was, right? And like I said, when you're torturing somebody to death, what they confess to is probably not reliable, right? This is the problem with confessions that are received at the end of torture, is you don't know if they're just saying whatever they think you want to hear so that you stop the pain and just kill them. But descriptions of this Mandalorian, or the image of Edessa, typically describe it as a small cloth, often folded, showing the face of Jesus. The shroud's a big piece of fabric. Now, was it folded in a way that it looked like a small cloth because only the face was being shown? Right? We don't know. But the descriptions of what this cloth is, this mandolin in the image of Edessa, do not match the physical description of the shroud. It is possible it was folded up to do that, but you don't have confirmation, right? And if you dismiss the legend about this King Abgar the fifth getting this image of Jesus on his face to heal him, right? The earliest dating we have of an image of Jesus on any kind of cloth, they bet that it's 6th century text, right? In that same image, we see it mentioned going up to the 10th century, gets moved to Constantinople, and then in the 13th century disappears. So that leaves you all of this. And the Templar connection seems to be the connecting the dots between Constantinople and France. But there's enough evidence here for me to at least entertain that speculation. I mean, I'm not downplaying this. This is speculation based on some pretty thin evidence. But the evidence against the shroud is carbon-14 testing of the shroud conducted in 1988. 3 independent laboratories in Oxford, Zurich, and Tuscan dated the cloth. They all got the same dates, 1260 to 1390. They had a 95% confidence level. Well, 1260 to 1390 is completely consistent when we know the shroud first came up. And to me, in the 80s, that just, that was the nail in the cuff for me. The problem is, we've had other people look at the shroud, and they think they took a piece of the cloth that wasn't original. Okay? And Raymond Rogers is he's a chemist and a shroud researcher. He argued that the 1988 sample was taken from a corner of the shroud called Ray's Corner, and he showed that the weaving pattern in that part of the shroud is different than the main part of the shroud. It's a 3-to-1 herringbone weave in the rest of the shroud. And what his suggestion was, instead of just sewing patches onto the shroud when it was damaged from handling, that they actually weaved new threads into the damaged area to make what seemed like seamless repairs with no stitching. And his argument, his evidence is pretty solid that that's the case. And based on Rogers' information, most of the people that have looked at this now think that he's correct, that they took a piece of the shroud that was not original. And the piece they did that they took out is consistent with medieval repair techniques. So if the repairs were made in the Middle Ages and you tested a piece that was repaired, that's solid. Now, the shroud was damaged in 1532 in Chambéry, France, resulting from fire marks and water stains. And the Poor Clare nuns repaired the cloth in 1534, patching damaged areas, and some argue that the 1988 came from a corner where less visible repairs, invisible reweaving, where they're actually taking individual strings and threads and weaving them back in there, were put in there. And that they're not part of the fire damage, but they're part of a repair that predates the fire. And the shroud's history of being handled, folded, or displayed for centuries would absolutely give the opportunity for damage, right? And the edges of the shroud would be more susceptible to damage. So the raised corner where the sample was taken is near the edge, a likely spot where reinforcement or patching would have been done to repair worn edges of the shroud. So that the study that he did really kind of opened that up. And then they did a further study measuring the vanillin. Okay? Now, this is a degradation product of lignin, and I don't know what any of these things are. And they found that higher levels in the main shroud. He argued that the older the linen, first century, would have little or no vanillin, while medieval repair would retain more, supporting the idea that the sample was newer than the main shroud. A microscopic analysis by Rogers and others suggested that the sample contained splice threads that were newer fibers woven into older ones, which is consistent with, and they showed other medieval cloths that had a similar repair technique. There's no scientific consensus that the 1988 sample was definitively from a repaired area, but the textile evidence is strong to support the idea that that's enough. Well, if the sample was taken from a medieval sample and it shows a medieval date, that negates the carbon-14 testing as a second piece of evidence that the shroud is medieval, right? So you have one piece of evidence against the shroud, which I was taken as the second piece to prove it was of medieval origin, and that second piece of evidence doesn't seem to be solid. And the presence of cotton fibers in the 1988 sample and other areas noted by some textile experts support possible medieval European influences, as cotton was more common in Europe during the Middle Ages than in first century Judea. Okay? So where linen was a predominant and less common doesn't mean equal that the rest is first century. But the fact that there is cotton in the patches also supports the idea that this was a later repair. Now, Max Frey, a Swiss criminologist, reported in the 1970s finding pollen grains in the shroud from plants native to the Middle East, suggesting a possible ancient origin. However, his methods were criticized in later analysis by Von Bryant, who found fewer Middle Eastern pollens and more European ones consistent with a medieval European context. But having fewer Middle Eastern pollens and more European, it just means they spent more time in Europe, right? If it was removed from Jerusalem fairly quickly after the crucifixion, it's not going to have a ton of pollens from Jerusalem, right? But if it has some from Jerusalem, how do you explain that if its origin started in France? And the shroud image, which is faint negative imprint of a crucified man, has been argued to resemble medieval artistic methods. And some researchers suggest that it could have been created using techniques like painting or rubbing or bas relief scorching, and were reasonable. So this Joe Nickel guy, he says he's replicated the image on the shroud. So I thought, well, if he's been able to replicate it, that really weakens the argument for it being real. So what Joe Nichols was able to make is the image here on the left. Okay? Kind of looks like a face. Right? I got both images right off of his website. Okay? Nowhere near the detail that we have on the image on the shroud, right? He doesn't explain whether his method was created very shallow marking into the cloth that doesn't penetrate. The shroud coloring, that discoloration is only 1/100th of the thickness of a human hair. That's how deep the coloration is. And Joe Nickel image doesn't share that quality. So if you are able to make a face, but you can't do the same type of image that's on the shroud, you haven't reproduced it. Again, just like Johnson overstated the evidence for the shroud, this Joe Nichols overstates the evidence against it, right? The image on the shroud appears to have resulted from a chemical change to the linen fibers themselves, specifically an oxidation or dehydration process that resembled accelerated aging. And it creates a straw yellow discolorant without the presence of pigments, dyes, or foreign materials. And Joe's image doesn't share any of those qualities. The image on the shroud exhibits a high level of detail, particularly in the depiction of wounds, bloodstains, and anatomical features. It's a photographic negative quality where the light and dark areas are reversed, only fully appreciated and viewed in a negative form. Joe's nickel image doesn't reproduce that level of detail. The image on the shroud encodes distance, and this is really one of the things. The distance, it means that cloth wasn't very tightly wrapped around the body. It's not a two-dimensional. It has 3D information in the shroud's image. Joe Nichols' image doesn't share that 3D imaging kind of thing. The idea of 3D imaging means that somehow what's on the shroud was like projected from the body. We don't know how they did that, right? The blood stains on the shroud have been tested and confirmed to be human blood, type AB, right? And with serum halos that they've seen in UV light. And they're distinct from the image, the body image, and the blood appears to have been deposited before the image formed. Okay? There's no image coloration beneath the blood stain. So Joe Nichols' image doesn't even attempt to stain the cloth with blood first and then reproduce it. And under ultraviolet light, the image on the shroud does not fluoresce. Okay? Now, many organic substances, like artistic materials, like paints and dyes and stuff, when you put them under UV light, they fluoresce. They shine off the thing. Nothing on the shroud does that. Joe's nickel image wasn't tested with ultraviolet light to show that it fluoresces or doesn't fluoresce. I suspect it would fluoresce, based on the description he gives of how he did it. So I appreciate Joe Nichols' attempts to reproduce the image techniques, because that's what you try to do when you have a hypothesis, is you try to either prove or disprove it. And if you can duplicate the image, that goes a long way to disproving it. But the fact that he couldn't reproduce it doesn't prove it's there, doesn't prove it's real, but it leaves it as an open hypothesis. Now, scientists haven't been able to explain how the image on the shroud was made. There's theories, but they can't explain it. And despite claims by Joe Nichols, no artist has ever been able to reproduce the image on the shroud. We only have sketchy evidence, possibly tracing the image on the shroud back before 1350, AD 1350. But that possible connection back to the Holy Lands, many centuries earlier, but this real sketchy. Max Frey, that Swiss botanist, identified those pollens, right? Native to the Middle East, blooming in the spring, consistent with a first century Jerusalem crucifixion. Now, he can't nail you to the first century, but he's saying those pollens were deposited during the spring. One was Jesus crucified in the spring, right? He also found traces of limestone, specifically travertine aragonite, found in the shroud, and they match other deposits in the Jerusalem around Damascus Gate. The woven pollen material analysis don't prove precise dates, but they support a Middle Eastern origin rather than European origin, right? And if the shroud was supposedly made in and around Jerusalem, it ought to have some evidence of that, and it does. All that stuff makes me go, right? Now, some researchers like Ian Wilson trace the shroud's history through early Christian art and text. And this is interesting. All the faces of Jesus prior to the Middle Ages, when we look at early art, resemble the guy in the shroud. They don't resemble that other half face that looks like some Jewish man with short hair and a beard, right? They don't resemble the pretty Jesus that we get today. They resemble the guy in the shroud. Well, that's a pretty big coincidence. And Codex Pray, again, this is 12th century, 1192 to 1195, shows a cloth with similar herringbone weave and burn marks, suggesting the shroud predates the C-14. Okay, so this is a book that has a picture, a drawing of a cloth, and the picture predates the first existence of the shroud. Well, I don't know about you, but pictures of me don't predate me. And if there's a drawing, a picture of the shroud that exists 150 years before we know the shroud exists, that indicates to me the shroud at least existed 150 years earlier, right? And Raymond Rogers in 2005 tested threads from the shroud's main body and found that vanillin, suggesting an age of 1,300 to 3,000 years. That's a big, big thing, right? Because 1,300 gets you back in the Middle Ages, and 3,000 gets you before Christ. But that kind of date range, the middle of that date range, gets you right around the time of Jesus. Giulio Fanti, okay, he's an Italian engineer, and he conducted Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy. Wow, I love this, right? FTIR. And it's called Raman spectroscopy and mechanical testing and tensile straight on the shroud's fibers obtained from earlier studies. Because carbon-14 destroys it, but they had enough fibers from earlier studies. He tested it. And he estimated the shroud's ages from 33 BC plus or minus 250 years. So you have all this other scientific evidence at least opening the door to possibility that the shroud is older, right? In 2022, Liberato De Cario and colleagues from the Italy's Institute of Christology used waxes, okay, to analyze the shroud by measuring the degradation of cellulose crystals. And they estimated the cloth's age at approximately 2,000 years, consistent with 54 to 74 AD. The peer-reviewed study, this is not somebody did an article for the internet. These are scientists who wrote a peer-reviewed study for Heritage 2022, directly supports the first century date using non-destructive methods. Like I said, carbon-14 destroys the sample it tests. The shroud depicts a crucified man with wounds matching a gospel account, at least somewhat matching, right? I mean, it talks about the level of whipping and stuff Jesus took. This man in the shroud appears to have been seriously beaten, right? With all kinds of tears in his flesh. Was it from a whip or from a cat of nine tails? Like I said, it's there. But a forensic pathologist, Robert Buckland and others noted the anatomical accuracy with the blood flow indicating a crucified posture with the arms at 65 to 70 degree angles and the legs bent. And what they're suggesting is the arms are, the way the elbows are bent, that the arms were just folded in, forced in, even though the man was in a state of rigor. The Shroud of Turin Research Project, STURP, in 1978 confirmed the blood type AB, hemoglobin, and serum albumin, indicating real blood from a traumatized individual, and the blood stain shows serum halos visible under UV light, suggesting a post-mortem clotting consistent with a body wrapped shortly after death. Jesus was dead on the cross. Any blood on the shroud, if the shroud is his burial cloth, would have been indicating that blood flow is post-mortem. And that's exactly what they found. All of this seems to support the idea that the shroud is real. A real burial cloth of Christ. But you get stuck. There's so much speculation between what we know in reaching that conclusion. Right? The shroud shows no signs of decomposition, putrefaction stains. The body didn't decompose in the shroud. indicating that that cloth was removed from the body within 2 to 3 days after it was placed on there, because the body hadn't started rotting. Okay? Jesus was only in that cloth for 3 days, if it's his. That's consistent with the evidence. The shroud is a high quality herringbone twill linen, rare but attested to in the first century Judea. Okay? If you notice, Jesus had his cloak, and they draw what do you call it, straws to get his cloak, because it was a fine linen cloth. We picture Jesus as this poor itinerant preacher, but apparently he had nice clothes. If Joseph Arimathea is Mary's uncle and was his thing, Joseph Arimathea was one of the richest men in Jerusalem. He's a minister of mining for the Roman Empire. He's on the Sanhedrin. He's in Joseph's tomb. Jesus might have had some nice clothes. And him being wrapped in fine linen, if he's the relative and was raised by a rich man, having this burial cloth is not inconsistent. And if you look at the amount of myrrh that they put in the tomb with Jesus, you're talking some serious money. And Joseph Arimathea put a bunch of myrrh in there, and the women went back with more spices on Sunday morning, expecting to anoint the body. But they describe, what did he put in there, 100 pounds of myrrh? This is like you going out and finding the most expensive fragrance you could buy and go buy 100 pounds of it. It's serious money. Joseph Arimathea has buku bucks. He may have been, Jesus might have been his ward for most his early part of his life. If Joseph, we don't know whatever happened to Joseph, Mary's husband. But again, speculation and tradition is that after Joseph died, that Mary was taken in by Joseph Arimathea and Jesus was his ward. That explains a lot of stuff in the Bible, if that's true. If, big if, speculation time, right? The image resolution and lack of distortion imply that it was not in a contact print, that it didn't get the sweat and whatever of the body by being wrapped tightly with the body. But there's one hypothesis. Again, hypothesis is speculation. It's a theory, untested theory, that it was a burst of vacuum ultraviolet. Okay? And this is that Lazaro's ENA state, and that's his thing. And he came up with the idea that in a vacuum ultraviolet, with 34 billion watts of per square centimeter, that he thinks you could reproduce this image. Now, they didn't reproduce this image. This is theory. This is speculation. It's a hypothesis, untested hypothesis, right? The shroud's image of a man with his knees and head bent, indicating the shroud was wrapped over a body that was already in rigor mortis. Rigor mortis had already started to set in before that shroud was, the cloth was there. According to the Gospels, it's pretty clear that Jesus hung on that cross after he was dead for 2 to 4 hours. Right? That's enough time for the legs to stiffen up, the head to stiffen into position. The arms would have been stiffened, but not so stiff that you couldn't have forced the arms in. It's kind of funny they made a shroud that had all that detail in there. Right? Forensic studies of the shroud by Frederick Zugaby suggests that the body shows sign of rigor mortis in the legs and head, but not necessarily full rigidity in the arms. And the crossed arm position could reflect a deliberate placement during burial preparations, or even some rigor was present, and that's why you still have the elbows bent. Jewish burial customs often involve washing a body and positioning the body quickly after death. We know they were rushing to get it done before sundown, before the Sabbath, right? And that they could have forced his arms. These are scientists looking at it going, yeah, this all seems to support this theory. I mean, if you're making a fake in the 14th century, they did a good fake, right? Now, the sudarium of Oviedo is a blood-stained cloth believed to have been used to cover the face of Jesus after his crucifixion. It's considered a separate relic from the Shroud of Turin, though they are believed to have been related to the same event. Okay? The blood on this cloth is also type AB, right? Now, we can date this cloth back to about 570 to 700 AD by both carbon-14 have confirmed it, right? And then it was initially kept in Jerusalem and it moved to Spain to avoid destruction by the invading Muslims, right? It eventually makes its way to Oviedo, where it has been kept since the 11th century. So the sudarium, it's got the blood stains on it, like somebody wiped his face with it, of a deceased person, but it doesn't have the image like the shroud because it wasn't present for the resurrection, if it's real. It's a smaller cloth. It's traditionally believed to have covered Jesus' face or head after death. John 26 and 7 describes a smaller head cloth that was separate from the rest of the burial cloth, right? In this scenario, the sudarium would have been placed on Jesus' face immediately after death and before the shroud enveloped his body. And the purpose of this practice to cover the face is ritualistic per Jewish tradition. It would not have remained in place during the resurrection event and therefore not have the image of the face, which it does not. So if the shroud is real and this other Oviatum, the Sudarium de Oviedo is real, then it wouldn't have his face, and it doesn't. So all this stuff kind of gives you reason to at least speculate that the shroud might be real. But I warn you big time, the church has gotten itself in a lot of trouble when it starts venerating relics. It starts worshiping anything except for this guy, God and Jesus, right? This is our thing of worship. You do not want to be worshiping some shroud. And if you put all your faith in the shroud being real and it's disproven tomorrow, what's that do to your faith? I'm telling you, the shroud, I give it more credibility than I did in the 80s because now the carbon-14 tests are suspect. And the best evidence about it being Middle Ages is it doesn't appear in the Middle Ages except for on this real speculative road back. So if you're new here, what I do is I go through my teaching, then I put on a song. I'm going to go try to read the chat. It's been jumping all over the place. I got quite a few comments. I'll read the chat. I'll come back and talk to you, and then we'll try to wrap this up. So let me put on a little longer than normal song. This is a rock and roll version of Psalm 51 by Michael Beatty, California. It gives me a little more time to read the chat. It's a little longer song. If you got to use the restroom, now's a good time. And I'll see you in a few minutes. We're back. We're back. So, yeah. No, I got smart people listening to me. going, going, hey, since it's Jewish tradition to wrap bodies in burial cloths, right? Shouldn't there be a bunch of shrouds out here that we can compare it to see how it matches other first century stuff? And yeah, there are extant burial shrouds from the first century AD. The problem is you have one that's called the tomb shroud. You got other things that are there. So we know it's a practice, but comparisons to the Shroud of Turin highlight key differences between these shrouds and the shroud. They don't contain images, the type of thread count, the type of herringbone. That shroud has a very fancy weave to it, right? That kind of stuff. So yeah, but I love that people listen to me are already asking like, hey, shouldn't there be other evidence? This is the way we should all be, is saying, are there other shrouds? Is this consistent? It's consistent in size. It's consistent in a lot of ways. The way it's wrapped over the body is consistent. Uh, it's consistent in containing blood stains. It's not consistent in having an image of a man on there, right? It is not consistent in it has the same type of linen, but it's a higher quality linen. That whoever was wrapped in this probably had money, or people around him with money. We know Jesus is buried in the tomb of Joseph Arimathea, one of the richest men in Jerusalem. That kind of supports that, right? You know, I mean, it's there. Whether Joseph was Mary's uncle, and that Jesus lived with Joseph as a ward of Joseph, that's all kind of Middle Ages speculation. You know, that's nowhere near as supported as the idea that we know Joseph Arimathea was a minister of mining in the British Empire. He was the tin miner, an official in the Roman Empire, as well as a Jew, and on the Sanhedrin. He was very wealthy. We know a lot of stuff about Joseph Arimathea from factual history. And then we have all this. There's myths and stories about Joseph Arimathea going to Britain, all kinds of stuff. Okay? That's all when you get off. And remember when I talked to you about getting lost in the weeds when you head down some of these rabbit holes? You can get lost in the weeds with Joseph Arimathea very, very quickly. But yeah, great question. But isn't it there? Yeah. So where am I on the Shroud of Turin? I'm a maybe. Could be. Not going to totally dismiss it. But I'm mostly at doesn't really matter to me. It's kind of cool if it's real. Not a big deal if it's not. It's there. But it's interesting that people that want to dismiss it as being like, oh, that was completely debunked. Well, when you actually look at the information, not totally debunked. But I am definitely not a Jeremiah Johnson, like, yeah, rah, 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 the shroud is real. And I am very cautious, super cautious about venerating any object. I don't care what it was. If you got me the cup that you can prove Jesus drank out of that cup at the Last Supper. Remember that cup of Holy Grail from the temple in the later Raiders of the Lost Ark movie? If you could get me that cup, I wouldn't venerate it. I mean, come on. What are we doing here? But very cool if God really did leave that kind of imprint in whatever the resurrection power is, however God reanimates a body and turns you from mortal to immortal, your body, and you're changed in the twinkling of an eye, whatever that is, that it has that level of power that it would imprint onto the fabric around you. That's awesome. So I'd like to tell you that I came to a 100% conclusion that the shroud is real or fake, but it's just not there. I probably lean more on the real side, but I might be 55%. I'm nowhere near 100% sure, right? You know what I'm saying? I'm over the 50%, but I'm not so far over that I'm convinced it's real. and I'm okay with those levels of doubt. I'm okay admitting when yeah, I believe I can prove Jesus rose from the dead using evidence in court, right? I believe I can prove God exists beyond any reasonable doubt, right? Those are different. Can I prove this to that level? Absolutely not. Is there enough evidence for me to go, yeah, maybe? Kind of like Bigfoot. Maybe, right? I, I'm not convinced Bigfoot's real, but there's enough evidence to go, maybe, right? That's kind of where I am with the shroud. It's a maybe true. And so we're here. But thank you all for joining me on my Freaky Fridays. Oh, I didn't do my introduction. Let me go back, and if you're new here, I broadcast Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. If you like what you heard, my name is Bill Donahue. I go by Donahue Papa. If it's horrible, my name's Max Snell. Okay, but it's a no. But I broadcast at noon Pacific time, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Monday and Wednesday, I'm in the book of Matthew right now, usually in a book of the Bible. I'm going through the book of Matthew. And on Fridays, I do stuff related to Christianity, but that I don't think you'll ever be taught in church. Tuesdays, I join my friend Neo on her program, and she broadcasts out of Central Time Zone about 10:30ish. Sometimes 10:15, sometimes 10:30, and she does it 5 days a week, and I join her only on Tuesdays. But Neo's great to listen to. I enjoy listening to Neo whenever I'm up that early. For those that don't know, that's 5:30 for me. So it's a little early for me to be on every day. But I make a point to get up on Tuesdays. But you might see me in Neo's shows other days. If I missed your question or a comment, just email me, bill@discerningtruths.com. I'll answer your question or another subject you want me to take a look at. I'll do it. I'll answer your email. I get people that send me DMs and stuff. I'm on a lot of platforms. And sometimes it's a week or more before I notice your DM. If you email me, I will get it that day and I will respond. A lot of times, email exchanges turn into studies. I do a lot of text on my streams. People would call this death by PowerPoint. But I do it because I'm going to create a PDF after I get off the air. And I'm going to upload that PDF on the Discerning Truth groups on Telegram. Nothing I do is behind a paywall. You can download that PDF, use it for your own stuff, research, whatever you want to do. Use it in your own study notes. It's there. I do write occasionally on Substack. I'm by no means a prolific writer over there. But I don't limit myself to religious stuff. I've talked about autism, about what's the purpose in writing, why to do stuff. I've done some religious things. I've written on crypto investing over there. Okay, I haven't written on politics, but I started out today on a little politics. If I was going to write something on politics, it'd be in Substack. It's not going to be on my stream. I started on Cloud Hub. I love Jeff Brain. He was great. Gave me an opportunity to stream. The people that, after Jeff passed away, that took over Cloud Hub, I think have run it into the ground. And after that last upgrade, they wiped out my entire account. I had regularly 500 listeners a day, and I was down. I had 2 followers, and they took away all my content. I just turned them off. It was like finish. So now all my replays are on Rumble and YouTube. Now Rumble has channels. And I made like 14 channels under Rumble. New Testament books, Old Testament books. Freaky Friday for today. Start here. Different kind of philosophy and thought. Different channels to organize my replays. I found channels long after I found playlists on YouTube. Now, so I have a playlist for every book I do. Like Matthew has its own playlist instead of being jumbled in with all other New Testament books. So there's far more playlists on YouTube than there are channels on Rumble. And the reason for that is all you got to do is like Discerning Truth 534 on YouTube, and you don't have to go in and like each individual playlist. Rumble, if you're going to like Freaky Fridays, that's all you're going to get notified of. You got to go back out in the Donahue Papa and into Start Here and like Start Here, and out the Donahue Papa into New Testament books and like that. Pain in the butt. Really bad system on Rumble. But so I didn't want to make you do that 60 times, right? I always promote my good friend Michael Beatty, California. For some of you, I had mentioned that he says I go off the rails on Friday. That's Michael teasing me. But Michael's still with Dilly in Florida. They had a great trip. He should be coming home this weekend. But he missed 3 days, but he's continued streaming. And Michael streamed this morning. So he's 5:30 a.m. Pacific time, no matter where Michael is. And like I said, if you see me at Michael's stream, you know I can't sleep because that's 2:30 a.m. for me. And I am not usually up at 2:30 in the morning. So I usually listen to Michael on replay. I listen, same thing when he's on with Dilly. I sometimes can catch him and Dilly live, sometimes not. But he's not going. He teaches 6 days a week generally, 5 days by Michael by himself, and on Sunday his wife Linda joins him, and they're going through Psalms. So that is who I promote, what I do. There's all kinds of other people that listen to me that I sometimes share their cards. People know that Singing Pretty, I tell her she's my study time DJ. And so when I'm doing my reading in the afternoons, a lot of times I'm listening to her playlist, what she does. If she puts a movie on, I go somewhere else just because I can't study and watch a movie, right? I mean, that's not going to make sense. And but she's over there. And then Revolver has his stream on Rumble. Again, I don't think I've ever caught Revolver live. I always catch in replays if I'm listening to what he's doing. Just the timing difference. But there's people worth listening to, people out here that are streaming good stuff. But there's so many people just putting out nonsense. Got to be careful. Show some discernment. All right. So with that, I'm going to get out of here for today. And God bless you all for coming.
That